wanted to ask someone who knew him, is that did he know some of his stuff made it down to Jamaica as well? And a lot of the Jamaican scene, like Lee Scratch Perry and King Tubby and stuff like that, they were always looking for new sounds as well. So the dub, kind of scene.
He didn't know that until very late in his life, but when we went to South Africa in the fall of 2003, spring over there actually, there were several Jamaican musicians at the Red Bull Academy, and he learned a lot about it and was delighted and really interested.
Yeah, whenever you hear strange sounds in the dub stuff, that's usually from the Moog keyboard, like the little frequencies, like boom, weird sounds. So yeah, the Jamaican scene. The guy who invented the remix, his name is King Tubby. He also was a technician, and he knew how to take machines apart and edit the tape by hand. So he was always looking for keyboard sounds. And in Jamaica, there was kind of an arms race for who had cooler sounds. So like Lee Scratch Perry, at one point, even when he was producing Bob Marley, he made his studio top secret, for the Kingston scene, and no one was allowed to see what equipment he had. Things like that. So there was always this kind of, like if you listen to Radiohead, like the Kid A album, they use this weird keyboard called the Owens Martinet, which is a very warm sound. So, I mean, there's lots of things to say how a keyboard or a specific sound of that keyboard can influence a lot of people's hearing.
That the instrument, the Owens Martinet, is one of those instruments that came actually invented in the late 1930s, and it was invented by a guy named Martinet. And he named it after himself, and Om in French simply means waves.
Yeah,
so he just called the instrument the waves of the Martinet. But that instrument was actually a successful electronic instrument and was sold as late as about, I looked it up at one point because I was just curious about it. It was sold well into the 1950s. And it was a very important instrument. And yes, it was used in Radiohead, and that's my favorite CD of Radiohead.
Yeah,
is that.
Kid A is a great album. But when you think about rock and you think about dub and the way people were using new tools and new instruments, I mean, we now are in the Pro Tools era, or we're in like Audio Logic. A lot of people have used the software. So the software has come to approximate the keyboards and stuff like that. In fact, if you get an iPhone or iPad app, I could show you even Moog keyboards, but it's all software now. But so when you see that dematerialization, when things become more and more digital, those are the tools of our time.
Yeah, I would mention something just as a personal thing. I've used Logic and then sort of reached a point where I've kind of returned to composing mostly acoustic music. And the difference, of course, the biggest difference is that I compose acoustic music sitting at the computer, with Finale, but I'm composing acoustic music primarily now, and I got the school got the newest version of Logic 9 Pro, and I took it home and did not put it in my computer. It's a confession that I have to make. I'm getting close to 79 years old now, and as much as I love some of the things that are happening, I'm happier playing my mini Moog and performing on my live on instruments in concert.
Oh yeah, I mean old school is cool, definitely.
Well, yeah, and when you got to enjoy the coolness.
Well, I'd like to make two comments about that. One is that Bob was an excellent historian of musical instruments. Philosophy is my area, so that's something I didn't know much about. And Bob was he was an extraordinary teacher. And so he was always a delight as he explained to me how instruments worked. And one of the things that he emphasized was that through the millennia, musicians have always gravitated to whatever was cutting edge. When harpsichords were invented, when pianos were invented, the new brass instruments of the 19th century, musicians were always composing for and playing whatever the latest thing was. So that was one of the reasons that he felt so strongly that the enormous innovations and changes that his inventions brought about were not in any way a bad thing or a different thing, or music wasn't going to go backwards because this was how it had always been. The other thing I'd like to say is just my own comment on what DJ SpOOKy was saying about the narrowing, in some sense, of music as it becomes digital. It seems to me that, this is a purely philosophical comment here, numbers are much more abstract, I think, than the phenomena that become first waves and then eventually matter. And I think that as you move away from analog to digital music, you are to some extent moving toward what is less material in a way that makes it less, it has less of the richness that actual physical phenomena have. And I think that the let's call it the thinner quality of digital stuff is due to that. But that's my editorial.
No, I totally agree. I mean, if you go back, and I majored in philosophy, so you know, I did my senior honors thesis on this guy Ludwig Feuerbach and the rise of post-rational aesthetics. Anybody when I talked about Nietzsche, you know, Nietzsche and Wagner, you know, but you know, the whole notion of centuries of Western culture was about the idea of tuning systems. So if you go back to Plato's Republic, for example, if you played a dissonant tone, or if you were out of tune with the city, you had to be expelled. You know, the Republic was all about these very specific tuning systems. So if you look at ancient Greece, they had, you know, the Pythagorean or Aeolian, or you know, there's all these Lydian, these different, you know, regions had specific tuning systems for telling stories. But what's amazing about our time is that we can simulate, sample, splice, dice, rip, mix, burn, you know, almost any specific other culture or time period. So we now have the entire amount of history of any instrument that you can make digital. So if you want a harp that's tuned, and that way you can just program it. Or so what's intriguing is that digital media versus analog versus just the idea. I mean, we're moving into this area where a very scarce resource right now is having a new idea about what an instrument. Can you imagine an instrument you can't imagine right now, right? So it's, you know, these kinds of things of, if something's at the edge of imagination, we're almost like not really sure how to use language to make it. But I think Bob was a really important figure for giving us these tools to think about the edge. So for example, like Adolph Sax, who invented the saxophone. Without the saxophone as a musical tool, you wouldn't have Charlie Parker, you wouldn't have John Coltrane. But without the Moog, you wouldn't have Pink Floyd, you wouldn't have half of the 60s rock scene, you know.
Yeah, and that whole correlation, of course, between technology and music and inventions in music is of course, a very logical one. And it's interesting because Adolph Sax came right around at the exact same time as the Industrial Revolution. You know, that was exactly where he was able, because at that point he was able to manufacture something out of brass that could be as complex as his own new instrument that he named after himself. I don't know, was that about, it was about 1820 something?
1840s.
It was in the 40s, yeah.
And nobody would use the saxophone for a while. Yeah. And I think the first composer to really use it was Debussy.
Debussy used it, yeah.
And it was a complete revolution in sound when people heard the saxophone.
And Ravel then used it in the only piece that he hated.
Right, but imagine that tool.
He's only famous for the only piece that he hated.
But, I mean, it's a funny moment because I feel like the tools keep changing, and there's so much software and so many new forms of everything that our generation hasn't had time to absorb things in a way, because it's just too much. You know, there's always an update, there's always a new version, there's always something, you know, so it's with these other instruments, especially with the Moog and especially with stuff like the saxophone or the theremin, they've now had decades, if not more, you know, of development. The piano is hundreds of years, the violin hundreds of years, cello hundreds of years.